Greetings, loyal ladies and gentlemen of the Garbage Gang. I wanted to take a minute before this episode to address the situation with Charlie Kirk. I didn't want to come out in the direct aftermath of what took place and put out a statement. I do feel like that when something like this happens, although I don't know we've ever seen anything exactly like this, but when these sort of tragedies happen, I don't want to take the focus away from the person, their family, because far too many people come out and try to get clicks by weighing in on what took place. Certainly didn't want to do that. That's not what this is about. But I also wouldn't feel comfortable not speaking about it at all. For somebody who went out there and encouraged discussions, as Charlie Kirk did, to have his life taken in such a way, in such a public manner, for voicing those opinions, for words, it's disgusting. It made me sick to my stomach. And I'm sure it made a lot of you sick to your stomach. And when something like this happens, when we see these kinds of tragedies, there's really not a whole lot of good words. I saw a pastor at Christ First in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, did a good job unpacking a lot of it. And really what I'd encourage people to do, if you're struggling at all to process any of this, really just look to God. Look to the Word. This is not a program where we talk about Christianity day in and day out. It's not the sole topic of our conversations, but really when it comes down to it, it's the most important thing in the world. So if you're wondering where to go from here, I'm sure a lot of people who sit behind a microphone or go out there and speak in public are considering whether this is all even worth it, whether you want to risk putting your family in that position. Heart just breaks for his wife and his kids. Whether you like the guy or not, he didn't deserve that. Whether you agree with what he had to say or not, I think we all got to agree it's not okay. And seeing the response from some people in the aftermath on social media just really makes you question humanity. Makes you question whether the United States of America is a failed experiment, to be honest with you. If something like this had happened to somebody with opposing political viewpoints, Bill Maher, for example, somebody who comes to mind because he's been openly critical about Christians and about conservatives. He said some frankly horrible things about Christians and conservatives. I never want to see something like this happen to somebody, no matter what they've said about people on our side. And to know that there are people out there who are celebrating this, who are condoning this, it just doesn't make me very hopeful for the future of this country. Like, how can we be countrymen with people who are celebrating this or who are condoning this? It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So instead of not doing this anymore and taking a step aside, I know a lot of you are having some of the same feelings that I am, and people around me are. Figured it's best to just get on camera, have a discussion. Hopefully it helps a little bit. I'm praying for Charlie's family, man. It's not right. It's not right. On that note, here's this week's episode.
Turn the lights down, and just put this on. It's right behind you.
The only garbage I see floating out there is just supporters.
I came to persuade you to avoid these dangers.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
If our union is to hold together, something must be done.
He will become founder of a mighty empire.
The fate of unborn millions now depends under God upon the conduct and courage of this army.
Various founders talked about this providential experiment that God had ordained and intervened at this unique moment in American history to make all of this happen.
Most of them believed that there were no accidents in history.
That hope for liberty was the light that under God, he would lead them.
All eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man.
Am I all mankind?
We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it.
It cannot be denied that with America and in America, a new era commences in human affairs.
America is something that I hold in my heart.
Americans of today should regain our bearings, that our nation is no accident.
Greetings, loyal ladies and gentlemen of the Garbage Gang. Welcome to another episode. Remember, if you want to be a member of the Garbage Gang, we need you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We've got a special guest in studio today. We've got Ralf Augstroze, and Ralf was a producer in the film The American Miracle. I highly recommend you check it out. It's available on DVD. We're going to get through the ins and outs of how this film was made and why it's so important. Ralf, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So how long have you been in film production?
Well, really most of my life. It was my original love. I probably knew around the age of 15 that I knew exactly what I wanted to do and pursued it with great veracity thereafter, and was involved in my high school in Dade County, Florida, in a film production and television production facility that had been set up there, one of the first in the country. And after that, went to the University of Miami to the UM's film school, and graduated there with a degree in motion picture arts and sciences, and as a cinematographer primarily, but learning the ropes in all the other various areas of film production. But then ended up going in all sorts of different directions career-wise. I worked for the federal government for a while right after graduating. I went into corporate America. I worked for RCA Corporation before it was a part of General Electric. I was there during the General Electric merger. I was involved in corporate communications at that time. From there, I went to a large financial fleet company that was moving its headquarters from downtown Manhattan to Princeton, New Jersey. They were putting in a full-blown TV studio, and they wanted someone with corporate television experience to come in and manage that. So I went and managed that. And that gave me an opportunity to go into the business world because it was a large financial company. It gave me the opportunity to sort of segue into some elements of the business world that I had some knowledge of and some propensity towards, and ended up doing international negotiation and mediation for about the next decade, spending more time outside of the country than I was in. And that was a lot of fun. And from there, I worked for the family business for a little while, went into the nonprofit world, did some work leading marketing and publicity for a homeschool curriculum company that was expanding nationwide, ended up in a historical nonprofit here in Philadelphia, the Providence Forum, that I ran for several years, published a best-selling book. I didn't write it, but I published it, called George Washington's Sacred Fire. It became a #1 national bestseller. So there have been a lot of different things that I've done along the way, but I've always kept a hand in film and television, which really was always my initial love. And, you know, going on all those various different directions professionally, you sort of wonder, well, what, you know, how is it? I mean, I really want to make movies. I want to do TV shows. Why am I doing this? Why am I in this, you know, General Electric and this financial company and this other stuff? And now that I'm producing motion pictures full time, it's starting to make sense, because you know, I'm a person of faith, and I accredit, you know, God with leading my life exactly where it's supposed to be. All of that was experience and education to be able to better to do what I'm doing now. So aside from just filmmaking skills and sort of those innate internal skills and talents that one has, I picked up an education along the way, OJT, you know, in finance and law and negotiation and international affairs and just all kinds of stuff. And now all of that is to bear on the projects that I'm working on. So that was a very long answer to your pretty simple question, so I apologize.
Well, I think it's a necessary answer, because we get to everything that was required to be in this position that we are with the American Miracle. Now, before we get to talking about the American Miracle, the business in Hollywood, not necessarily known for, you talked about being a believer, not necessarily known for being friendly towards believers. Did that ever come into consideration while you were choosing which route to go with your career?
You know, not really. To be honest, it never came up. I was never put in a position where I had to make a difficult decision because someone was going to give me less of an opportunity because I was a believer, a person of faith. That's who I was. People who knew me well knew that about me, and I'd have to say that probably most of those people liked that fact, because they knew that I may be, you know, a little more open, honest, trustworthy, loyal, possibly because of that profession of faith. So I never saw it hurt me. Now that I am producing motion pictures full time, you know, there's a whole sector of the entertainment industry that is exploding based on family-oriented, in many cases faith-based, but family-oriented, you know, movies that you can take your little kids to and grandma and not have to worry about what it is they're going to see or hear. That is an explosive sector of the entertainment industry right now, and especially television and film. So any of those biases that may have been there are sort of accepted, you know, now that this is something that people want to be in. It's a product that people want to have access to, and there's no shortage of opportunity to produce family-friendly, faith-friendly, patriotism-friendly programs that cater to that audience. And a lot of studios are jumping onto that bandwagon.
In general, it seems that the loudest voices over the last decade or so have been telling us that America is not a Christian nation, and really criticizing the founding fathers as being nothing more than a bunch of racists, things of that nature. What made it so important to you to start working on this project in the American Miracle, and how did it come about?
My colleague Tim Mahoney, there were three producers of the movie, of which I was one: Tim Mahoney, Doug Maddox, and myself. We all came from different backgrounds, but all involved in the motion picture industry with our own studios and our production companies and efforts. Tim had worked with Michael Medved before in the past on other documentary movies that he had produced. And Michael Medved, who your audience may or may not be familiar with depending on their age bracket, Michael Medved is a very successful writer. He was a speechwriter in the White House many, many years ago. He became a recognized television film critic on the PBS program Sneak Previews, which was a national program that PBS produced. Michael Medved was on there with Jeremy Lyons for, I think, 12 or 15 years, a very long time. And he became known as a very astute film critic during that time. But he was also an attorney. He was also a radio personality, a speaker, a speechwriter, and an author, and a historian. So among the many books that Michael wrote that became New York Times bestsellers, one was called The American Miracle. And that book got the attention of many people in Michael's circle. And because Michael knew Tim, he came to Tim and said, I'd like to turn this into a motion picture, this book. Would you be interested in producing it? And Tim got together with myself and with Doug Maddox, our third producer, and we all agreed that this was a worthwhile project. So that's what we embarked on. And the thesis for Michael's book is all of the almost countless events in American history that are very difficult to explain other than miraculous, where all the odds were against us. But by the founder's own admission, these were events that could not be explained in any other way other than divine providence, or as George Washington said, the invisible hand of providence. So the movie was beginning to be developed based on Michael's book, but the book is pretty large, and there's a lot of information in there. So we chose several chapters from America's foundational history, starting sort of with the French and Indian War, leading up to the death of George Washington, the Constitutional Convention before that, and encapsulated several of those stories into the movie with an eye of producing sequels. So there will, God willing, there will be more American Miracle movies. This one, the subtitle of this movie is Our Nation is No Accident. But we kind of left off with the Louisiana Purchase. We those of the audience who will have watched the movie all the way to the end will have seen a bonus scene at the end of the credits. And I'm not going to give all of it away, but it teases the Louisiana Purchase. And that's where the next movie will pick up.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. There are so many things that are pointed out in this film that cannot be explained. And what I thought was interesting is one of the professors, I believe it was, they were interviewing, said that you could sort of explain it away by saying that Washington was a great general and he made great decisions. But that's really nonsense when you look at the things that happen where the weather intervenes and things couldn't have taken place without storms or fog or whatever the case may be. I, frankly, as all this was happening, was thinking in my head, wow, Washington was actually a pretty terrible general because but for the intervening weather causes, they would have been done. Am I right?
Yeah. And actually Joseph Ellis, who we interview, Pulitzer Prize winner in history and National Book Award winner. I mean, he's sort of the king of the historical literature hill right now in the United States. He makes the point that Washington lost more battles than he won. So, yeah, you can say that he was generally a very astute general and leader and strategist. But the role that divine providence played in the victories, even the retreats, we as children, we learned that little phrase, those who fight and run away live to fight another day. Well, he knew when to retreat, he knew when to fight, and he knew when to run. And that in combination with these incredible events, how on a night with a clear sky, all of a sudden, this thick, impermeable fog appears that hides the American troops, the colonist troops, retreating from Brooklyn to Manhattan under the noses of British warships that are all around them, and don't lose a man in the process, because all of a sudden, wasn't the night for it, wasn't the weather for it, weren't the conditions for it, this fog appears out of nowhere. And they safely retreat with all of their thousands of men. So they themselves, including George Washington, credits that providence with how this all came about.
On top of that, the amount of times that really, by all accounts, he should have been killed, and how close he was to death, with near misses, and just completely inexplicable, the part where he's out there on the horse and everything.
Oh, yeah.
How many times should he have been killed in battle?
Yeah, countless times. And it starts even before that. I mean, as a youth, he contracts smallpox. And he's off in Barbados with his brother Lawrence, who had TB. Eventually, he succumbed to his TB. But George Washington got a form of smallpox, and at that time, smallpox was a pretty prevalent thing. But once you've had smallpox, you're immune to it for the rest of your life. So later, when his troops were afflicted by smallpox way down the road, when he was already a commanding general, he was completely safe. So that's just the beginning of those stories of miracle. And you mentioned, the Braddock's defeat, the Battle of Monongahela in the French and Indian War, where every officer around him was killed, practically. He had 2 horses shot out from under him, and he got out of there unscathed. Absolutely nothing. I mean, it was nothing short of a miracle. So you're absolutely right.
That's the word, is miracle. What made it so important for you to get this message out there?
I think that this time in our country, but that's actually a little unfair. I think that in the modern era of American history, there has been an increasing self-reliance and pride in people's individual achievements. And there's certainly cause and merit to that pride. But in many cases, there's been that invisible hand of Providence that's been a part of those accomplishments. And our foundational history is replete with those stories. So we just felt like this was the right time to take that very important book that Michael Medved wrote, The American Miracle, and turn it into something that more people would see than might attend a lecture or, pick up the book years after it was published. The book was published, I believe, originally in 2016 and did very well. It was a best-selling book. But we live in a movie sort of culture. People love watching movies, whether it's in the movie theater or now streaming or on your home TV. It is still a medium that speaks very powerfully to its audience. And so we realized that turning this into a film was probably going to be the way that we would get the farthest reach and the greatest engagement from an audience. So that's how we ended up producing the movie. And there were people around Michael who wanted to see this movie made. So the financing fell in place. The production all fell into place. It's a big movie. You've seen it. That we shot that movie across the country in various historic locations and various recreations of historic locations. I mean, we've got horses and guns and battles and cannons, and we had stunt supervisors on the set. We had armorers on the set. The first day we shot that scene, the Battle of Monongahela. That was the very first day of production. We had over 200 people on set between cast and crew and horse wranglers and stunt supervisors and camera people. We had 5 cameras running for many of those shots in that particular battle scene. So it's a pretty big deal, thank God, went very smoothly.
It's amazingly put together. I will say this, my wife, who's not a history buff by any stretch of the imagination, said that it was one of the most enjoyable accounts of history that she's been able to participate in. Frankly, said that she wished that school was more like that and they should be showing this in schools everywhere. Is that a possibility, or we're going to see
that's
this
our
being
hope.
shown to children?
Yeah, that's our hope. We made it with that in mind. This is really an evergreen project. We were very vigilant of the fact that we were going to release the movie a year in advance of the 250th anniversary of the United States, 2026, the semi-quincentennial. So we knew that we were going to release in advance of that, and we were hoping that it would gain traction so that it would really pick up speed during 2026. We're going to re-release it theatrically. It's currently streaming. It's currently available on DVD and Blu-ray. but we're going to make some adjustments to it. There were some scenes that were left on the proverbial cutting room floor that we're going to re-examine. We're going to just do some tweaks here and there, and we're going to re-release it in 2026, which is what a lot of people want us to do. They want to be able to bring more people to see the film and for it to have more of an impact. So it's high praise from your wife. She's obviously a woman with outstanding taste.
If people want to stream it, what are the ways that it's available for streaming?
It's online, AmericanMiracleMovie.com right now. There are major streaming services that I won't mention that are currently negotiating with us because they want to stream it on the ones that you are most likely to already have in your household. But we're in the process of negotiating that right now, so I can't go into any detail on that. But for the time being, you can stream it at AmericanMiracleMovie.com, which is also where you can get the DVD and the Blu-ray.
I highly recommend it. And one of the really bright spots for me was the commentary by Richard Dreyfuss. I thought it was really cool that he knew so much about it and seemed so passionate about it. It seems like this is something he really, really cares about. And of course, he's got an incredible delivery with the way he presents things. I also was somewhat surprised that somebody in his position would be willing to appear in something like this, because it feels like there's been such high tensions in this country, and something as simple as acknowledging God's role in the nation's founding or being proud of the nation's founding are things that are controversial. I hate to say it, but it seems like we are at that point in society where simple things like that are controversial. How did he get involved in the film?
Well, logistically, he got involved because of his relationship with Michael Medved. And Michael Medved was the one who opened the door to us working with him. But he was very pleased to be a part of this project. I mean, he knew what sort of our personal backgrounds were and that we were believers and people of faith. He's a Jew, but he is, I would say he's not a practicing Jew. So for him, it would have been a little bit of a stretch to say that he really wanted to participate in this pro-faith project. But that was not his idea. His motivation was he has always been a big fan of American history. And he feels that children today are being done a disservice in school by not being taught civics the way that we were taught when we were in school. Now, you're a lot younger than I am, but I remember from when I was in school, civics was a mandatory part of elementary school, certainly high school, understanding our history and our government and how it works. And Richard says, one of the things he says is that, Americans have an incredible privilege of being citizens of this country, but they don't really understand fully what that means and how to exercise that privilege and the authority that places in them as American citizens to become a part of the process. So that's the perspective from which Richard was very interested in being a part of this film project. Is first of all, he loves Michael, but he also understood how important it is that Americans of all generations are reacquainted with their history and who the founders were, what their worldview was, what their perspective was, what were these events that caused the formation of America. And then really, what responsibility does that place on you, the viewer of this movie, to perpetuate what it is you've just seen the founders as having done? So he would be very much, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but from my perspective, he's very much against the casual, American, which some that have wanted to be unkind have said, fat, dumb, and happy. That we are recipients of such privilege and such benefit by being citizens of this country that we take for granted the things that we can be doing and should be doing to perpetuate that for successive generations, as opposed to just enjoying all of it ourselves for whatever creature comforts may come along with it. So again, was a long answer to your question, but Richard is a little bit of a complicated person. I would be hard pressed to tell you that he's a conservative or a liberal or a Republican or Democrat or an independent or a libertarian. I would almost say that he probably doesn't identify with any of those. He's very American. He's very much a patriot, and he very much wants Americans to understand what privileges and powers and authority and responsibility they have to maintain that.
He also talked about the Articles of Confederation. I'm glad that that was addressed, because for most people, their brain goes from war, Constitution, and there's no discussion about what goes on in between. So I thought it was great that that was at least addressed to some degree, and he talked about that.
Yeah, and it just illustrates the various things that went on during that period to get to the point where we are now, where we have this Constitution, that is the most enduring Constitution in world history. There was a lot that went into that process, and if you watch The American Miracle, you will be refreshed of all of that information.
They weren't necessarily getting along and in total agreement with everything at that point in time either. We see the disagreements that we have today in this country, and I think that in some instances the level is disgusting and heartbreaking. But it's not like they were out there all holding hands, getting ready.
Yeah, not at all.
When they're drafting the Constitution, were they?
Not at all. Not at all. And it was again the wisdom of George Washington, who was able to mediate and bring people together. One of the things that I think historically has been lost on the American people is if George Washington had not been asked to preside over the Constitutional Convention, I don't know if half the delegates would have shown up that did. But because Washington was such an incredible figure already by then in American history, and having led the country in the Continental Army through that revolution, and then served 8 years as president of the United States, and then freely of his own will relinquished that power and said, I've done my job, I'm going back to my farm. To use the biblical quote that he uses, to sit under my vine and fig tree. That's who George Washington was, and America knew that. So they knew that the only way that the Constitutional Convention would succeed is if someone like George Washington was sitting in the speaker's, the chairman's chair. And that's why all these people came and said, wow, Washington's going to be there. We've got to go. We've got to be part of that.
And there was one little part of the miracle that helped it cross the finish line, right? Somebody disappeared at some point.
Yeah. There was a delegate who realized that he was in the minority, but again, another stroke of divine providence. He knew that what was going on was for the betterment of the country, and even the other representative from his state was not on the same page as he was. And inexplicably, right before the vote, he stands up and walks out. And essentially there's no more dissenting voice. And, the Constitution was voted for and ratified. And that famous soliloquy by Ben Franklin, that was key. Ben Franklin is thought of as being a deist, sort of the textbook definition of a deist. He believes in a creator God who sort of gets the world going, gives it a push, and then walks away and lets things sort of go on their own. But Ben Franklin, stands up towards the end of the Constitutional Convention, and with all of this conflict between the delegates, and essentially calls for prayer. And James Madison, who had the most accurate, copious notes and minutes from the Constitutional Convention, recorded Ben Franklin's monologue verbatim in his notes. And we have the actor Barry Stevens, who does a brilliant job at portraying Benjamin Franklin, deliver that monologue that he delivered in the Constitutional Convention. And it's sort of a linchpin in the Constitutional Convention. All of a sudden, people are agreeing with one another, and people understand each other, and there's the discord sort of disappears, and the next thing we know, we have a Constitution.
That's what I was going to say, was that actor was pretty incredible.
Barry's very good.
In my head, he's Ben Franklin.
He is.
I watched Ben Franklin on the screen. That was it.
Yeah, he absolutely is. He's very good at that, and he's also a very good actor. So he really brings life to that character.
Same with the woman who played the slave bringing the lawsuit. That was another incredible wrinkle.
Nicole C. Mullen. That name will be familiar to those who are fans of contemporary Christian music. Nicole C. Mullen has been a staple in contemporary Christian music for 20 years. With incredible best-selling albums and award after award and so forth. And this was her first theatrical acting role, if you can believe that. Most people who we tell that to don't believe it, because she knocks it out of the park. She plays Elizabeth Freeman, who's a slave who in Massachusetts sued her owner for her freedom, and the court granted it. So it was one of those original landmark cases, not the first, but one of the original landmark cases of a slave gaining their freedom after legal action against their master. And Nicole just does such a marvelous job, and really she's an extraordinary actress. We've all been sort of coaxing her to continue down that path and to seek more roles in more films and television.
It was great the way it was set up with the courtroom scene and everything like that, and addressing the constitutional issue. And as somebody who spends time in court and has throughout my career, you sort of imagine what would it be like being in this brand new sort of legal system. We've got this constitution, in this instance it's the state constitution, but it's something that's brand new, and they're really basing everything off of the processes you've got in England, but translating that, this is a brand new country, and that's part of the argument that's made by the attorney in that situation.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to think back to what that would have been like, you're in uncharted territory, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, one little peek behind the curtain, a little behind the scenes anecdote on that. We were filming, we needed to film the Constitutional Convention scenes in essentially the room that looked identical to the assembly room at Independence Hall, the Pennsylvania State House at that time. And I have filmed inside Independence Hall in Philadelphia before. And they're very good to work with. The park rangers there, the people who manage it for the National Park Service, have been wonderful to work with. And we could have filmed that Constitutional Convention scene there in Philadelphia. But the problem is it's open to the public every day from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So we could have had access to it for as many days as we needed to, but we would have had to move in at 5 p.m., shoot through the night, light the exterior of the building so it looks like sunlight is coming in, and rearrange everything, and then before 9 a.m. strike everything so that it looks like we were never there, and at 5 p.m. that day start again from scratch. And everybody would have had to work during the night and sleep during the day. It would have been a logistical nightmare. So again, by the hand of God, we found a facility in Houston, Texas, that had just been completed, that is an exact replica of Independence Hall. I mean, down to the millimeter, the paint, the furniture that's been recreated. It's used as a teaching facility for Houston Christian University, HCU, in Houston. And there's only one difference. The tower, the bell tower on that Independence Hall is 1 foot higher than the one in Philadelphia, because everything's bigger in Texas. So they were very proud of that fact. But in any event, directly across from that, as in Philadelphia, across the hall from the assembly room is the first Supreme Court chamber. At the time when the Elizabeth Freeman trial would have taken place in Massachusetts, it would have been a very unassuming country courtroom, little more than a room with some benches for people to sit in, a table not too much different than this one for the judge, and it would have looked very provincial. But we were in this exact replica of Independence Hall. We had an exact replica of the original U.S. Supreme Court chamber that looked beautiful on camera. So we thought to ourselves, you know what, let's take advantage of this and let's shoot the Elizabeth Freeman scene in that courtroom setting. So was it accurate? In that case, not terribly in terms of the setting. But looks beautiful on film.
Yeah, a little bit of artistic liberty. That's not
definitely.
really going to mess with the story or anything like that.
Yeah.
So you've also been involved in Christian film projects in the past. Kevin Sorbo played a brief role in American Miracle.
He did. He portrayed the younger Thomas Jefferson. The elderly Thomas Jefferson was played by Pat Boone. So you probably know who Pat Boone is.
I do.
There are a lot of people younger than you who sort of glaze over when we say Pat Boone was in the movie. Okay, yeah. But, people closer to my age would know who Pat Boone was. Pat Boone, as he reminded me when we were filming with him, in the late 1950s, Elvis Presley opened for him.
Wow.
Yeah, so that just indicates what kind of a star Pat Boone was back in the late 50s, early 60s, actually into the 70s. But Kevin Sorbo portrayed the younger Thomas Jefferson during the Declaration, the writing of the Declaration, and also his reaction from France, where he was during the Constitutional Convention. But then we filmed some Louisiana Purchase scenes with him that ended up not getting into this movie. That will be a part of the next movie, the sequel to this. But we used just a little bit of that as a teaser at the end of the movie, where he's trying to sell some of his aids on the merits of the Louisiana Purchase. So people will hopefully enjoy that.
Got to watch it all the way through to get there.
That's right.
Kevin Sorbo was in another project of yours, wasn't he?
He was. Kevin and I worked together in another movie that I produced some years ago called Against the Tide. And Against the Tide was also a theatrical motion picture. It played during COVID. So probably didn't have quite the audience in the movie theaters that we would have hoped for at that time, but it's done extremely well after that in DVD and in streaming. But Kevin played a character in a film quite a few years ago called God's Not Dead. And he played a character, Professor Radisson, who was a very vehement atheist professor at this fictional university. And he ends up into sort of a mental and philosophical tussle with a student who happens to be a believer about whether God exists or not, and hence the title of the movie, God's Not Dead. And Kevin Sorbo's character, Professor Radisson, uses reasoning from Stephen Hawking to claim that there's no reason for God to exist, that the universe can and will create itself out of nothing, and sort of that, and the student uses John Lennox, a professor of mathematics at Oxford University, to back his argument that God does exist. And he goes forward and presents a case to the class to prove that God does exist the way that the student understands it. So we took that tussle and created a documentary out of it and brought John Lennox from Oxford University and Kevin Sorbo, now the actor Kevin Sorbo, together to explore the questions raised in God's Not Dead in those fictitious characters and those fictitious scenarios. And then essentially over the course of 2 hours, they explore the scientific elements and questions that were discussed in the movie. And then they go to Israel and actually look at some of the evidence for the existence of Christ and all that. So again, I don't want to give away too much of it so that people can actually see it and enjoy it for themselves. But that was the first time I had the pleasure of working with Kevin Sorbo, who was just a joy to work with. And when we were casting for this movie, we told our casting agent that we'd really like Kevin involved, and probably the young Thomas Jefferson role was one for him. So
he's done some really great things over the years.
He sure has. Starting from Hercules.
Right.
Do you know that Hercules is still one of the most popular syndicated television programs around the world?
Really?
When I travel to different parts of the world and turn on the TV and just channel surfing before I doze off, inevitably I'm going to come across a channel where Kevin is on screen, dubbed in German or Italian or Chinese or something in a Hercules rerun. So the Hercules series is doing very well. And after Hercules, Kevin was actually, he had a starring role in one of my favorite sci-fi series called Andromeda, which was on for several years. That was a Gene Roddenberry, another Gene Roddenberry story. So Kevin's an interesting guy, and he's been shunned sort of by mainstream Hollywood.
Well, honestly, when I say that he's done great things, I was talking more about the Christian films that he's done. God's Not Dead and who was Left Behind, I think, that he was involved in.
Left Behind, Let There Be Light, which is a movie that did very well theatrically, that was produced by Sean Hannity. And Kevin is a wonderful actor, and he's wonderful to work with. He's a very deeply devout Christian man. Sam Sorbo, his wife, who actually introduced me to Tim Mahoney originally when we kicked off our relationship in producing this movie. Sam Sorbo introduced us. And Sam's wonderful, and another great Christian woman, very active in the homeschool community, and a great actress by her own right.
And I will say that growing up, Christian movies were lacking, to be nice. Not
Agreed.
put together very well or anything like that.
Agreed.
So to see the stuff that Kevin's been in, pretty cool to have that around and start to put together some quality things of artistic value.
And it's getting better.
It is getting better. Seems like it's getting better. But Against the Tide is interesting because it's not an acting role, really. It's more of a documentary. But it's a topic that I think is one of the most fascinating that you could ever possibly explore. Because if you are somebody who's a believer and you encounter non-believers, there are a whole lot of questions they'll typically have. Or if you're somebody who's not a believer and you're even examining the possibility of the existence of God, these are all questions that are going to come up. And for the most part, it seems like mainstream media or pop culture will paint Christians as stupid people. They're people who can't think for themselves, and they're not intellectuals. Higher education, that seems to be the thing too, right? People who believe in this, they're just not able to think for themselves, and they're not critical thinkers. Where the documentary shows the exact opposite, that you can be a critical thinker, you can be somebody who thinks things through, can be an intellectual and still be a Christian, or at least believe in the existence of God. What do you think about that? Am I off base saying that there seems to be some kind of public perception that can't go hand in hand to be an intellectual critical thinker and also believe in God?
I think that's always been the case. I'm not sure that it's anything that's more pronounced recently. There may be a feeling that it's more pronounced recently because we have much better communication tools at our disposal than we have over history. So now anyone who wants to profess something can do so easily by accessing social networking. I when I do lectures and master classes and things, I say, when I went to film school, it took millions of dollars of equipment to learn how to be a filmmaker. Now, all you need is that little thing you carry in your pocket, and you can be up on YouTube, and millions of people can be watching you by the end of the day, and all it cost you was the cost of the phone. So now all of those tools are in place, and people with all sorts of different perspectives and opinions can get those opinions out there. I think I have a pretty simplistic approach to that question. I think that personal pride and individual pride is something that tends to get the best of all of us, and some of us more so than others. And for some, it's completely anathema to accept that there may be a higher power to whom they may be responsible. In my perception, the evidence for the existence of God is so much greater than the non-existence of a higher power that created the world and the universe and set it in motion, and holds everything together. It's a huge topic. I mean, we could spend several programs on just this topic, and I'm woefully incapable of adequately defending it, myself. But, Sir Isaac Newton, the father of modern science, the creator of calculus, wrote more about theology than he did about physics. Many people don't know that. It's not possible to know that. unless you've actually been taught it, or unless your teacher in school has told you about that and has illustrated that. Some of the greatest scientists in history were devout Christians. There's no conflict between science and Christianity and theism. So John Lennox says, I don't have the faith to be an atheist, because it just requires too many improbable, impossible things, like the universe from nothing. The most of science has agreed that there was a Big Bang, and the question is then, as John Lennox puts it, who was the Big Banger? Who created that spark to create the universe from nothing? So again, it's a large topic, but I think you can get the idea of which side on that argument I land on.
You mentioned his character and God's not dead. One of the things about that particular character is he had bad things happen to him in his life that were inexplicable to him from his perspective. How could a God who is supposedly good and loving allow something like this to happen? And those are very difficult conversations. It's very difficult to answer those questions for somebody. I don't think that the existence of God necessarily hinges on whether we could know or understand each and every thing that happens to us, or that we know and understand or agree with every decision that's made by God. I don't think God's existence is one and the same with that, but it seems to be something that's very common, at least with people that I've spoken to. And I get it. If somebody has a child who died from some disease or something like that, it's completely inexplicable how that could make any sense, or what any reason for that would be. And we're in the wake of the Charlie Kirk situation. This is a guy who had a wife, he had kids, and he gets murdered in front of the entire world in a brutal fashion for going out there and speaking. Nothing else. He didn't harm anybody. And I can understand how somebody looks at that and says, how could there be a God that allows this to happen? Is that a fair question?
It's a fair question, and it's a question that humanity has struggled with since the beginning of time. So it's difficult to find an answer to that, other than to realize that first of all, we live in a fallen world. From the initial rejection of God in Genesis, we live in a fallen world. We live in a broken world. We live in a world in which God has also given his creation, us, autonomy to make decisions on our own and to decide whether we want to fall in line with his laws and his teaching about how we should live our lives. But because we live in a fallen world, we do make poor choices. There's evil in the world. We are subject to that evil from time to time. Sometimes it's inexplicable. I would argue that it's amazing. If you've been following the news the last day or two, there were 900 Turning Point campus chapters prior to Charlie's assassination. There have since then been 37,000 requests for new Turning Point chapters. So could it be argued that more good will come from this? Then obviously the incredible sorrow that the family and those around Charlie are feeling. But will something greater be accomplished from this in the long run? Well, time and history will tell. And John Lennox also, he says that God understands suffering, and it's one of the examples of that is him sending his own son to the cross to suffer and die. So it gives us some level of peace to understand that there are things that we can't understand, and we have to keep on, and we have to push forward.
It would be difficult in the perspective of his children or his wife to think that there is anything that is good that comes out of it, essentially. I would think if it were my family member and you say, oh, well, this is going to happen as a result of this, like, don't care, want my family member back. Yeah,
sure.
I don't care what he says. And I think it's sometimes tough if we take the perspective that there's some kind of silver lining to everything, because there are certainly situations where sometimes there just ain't.
Yeah.
Right? Like, a kid dies of cancer. It's really, the mind can't conjure a silver lining that comes from something like that. And we know that God's ordained everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so for whatever reason, I think you said it really well when you say that it helps to know that we're not going to understand everything. I don't know if I quoted you exactly there, but
we're not meant to understand everything.
A kid on a television show, it's silly, but he said that he understands that trying to understand God is like an ant trying to understand what we're thinking about. And when you put it that way and you think about it, it makes sense. Doesn't really help or answer a whole lot of questions for us while we're here right now. And for somebody who's not a believer, you see that be a hurdle for quite a few of them, don't you?
You know, I mean, I've been an active member of my church and church life for all of my life, practically. I've seen every kind of suffering that you can imagine, from within my own family, where, you know, my grandparents escaping World War II ravaged Northern Europe, fleeing communism, ended up having half their family killed by being bombed in the bombing of Dresden, and a building falling on top of them, and all of the various other things that people encounter. I've seen all of that, you know, and I understand that. But, you know, there are so many things that we deal with on a daily basis that we don't understand. You know, two basic things with which we deal with every day: time, space, and gravity. We have no idea what those things are. We have no idea what time is. We have feeble ways of measuring it by these devices we wear on our hands. But time is a completely abstract, unknowable concept to us. We have no concept of what time is. We have no concept of space and infinity. What is infinity? We don't grasp what infinity is. You know, we're not floating around this room because there's gravity. But what it is that gravity is that's actually keeping us with our feet on the ground, we don't have a clue. We have no idea. Science has no answer for those questions. So it gives me some level of peace to understand that there are things that I don't understand and that I can't understand. And the question of, you know, theodicy, of why bad things happen to good people who believe and worship a good God, we will know in time.
You talk about what is infinity. One of the important things about Christianity is the concept of eternity, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you ever really want to trip out, start thinking about what eternity means.
Yeah. Yeah, you can lose your mind thinking. Yeah.
So you go 1 trillion years, and then you do another 1 trillion years, and then you do another 1 trillion years. It's when I start thinking about it, I can say personally, after a few seconds, it's like the computer crashes.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But I'll tell you one concept that sort of helps me. And again, my relationship with John Lennox and others of his ilk have helped me understand it, in the sense that if we accept and somehow in our minds can rationalize that, let's say, God and eternity exist outside of time and space. You know, we're limited by our very feeble perception of the universe around us. I mean, just look at those photographs from the explorer on Mars taking a picture back towards Earth, and you can barely see Earth. It's like this little tiny pinpoint in this massive ocean of stars. And if you accept that time and space are sort of like an enclosure, and that there is a power and an entity and a force that exists outside of that, then it becomes a little bit easier to accept it, because, there's a hand out there that can reach in and alter things in that time and space. And, the American Miracle is one example of that.
That is a great example of it. And people need to check it out, because a fascinating watch. If you're somebody who's into history, you'll like it. If you're somebody who's not into history, then it's a good baseline. You'll still enjoy it thoroughly. Wanted to go back to the God conversation, because we were talking a little bit about how we're not going to understand these things, and bad things happen, and sometimes you really don't come up with any explanation that would make anybody feel any better. But you've decided to be a believer. If you had to sum up why you're a believer, what would that look like?
It's difficult for me to answer that question. I get asked that question quite a bit. We've done so many interviews and a lot of publicity and things for the movie and all that. I get asked that question from time to time. Frequently in conversations, people say, "Well, when did you become a believer? What was the point that sort of you became a believer?" And I grew up in the church. I am the product of two Baptist pastors. Both my grandfathers on my maternal and paternal side were pastors. So I grew up in the church. I grew up in an atmosphere in which being a believer was the way it was. That's the world in which I grew up. So, we all go through periods in our lives where we question our faith. And one pastor that I knew a long time ago said that asking those questions is good, because when you ask those questions, it means you have a general interest, and that this is something that concerns you. And usually when you ask questions, you get answers, whether it's some theologian that you trust, or your pastor, or a friend, or a family member, or whether it's that still small voice, that you sometimes hear in your mind. I think that when you ask those questions, you get the answers, and it reinforces what it is you grew up with. So I never had a point at which I sort of became a believer because I realized that that's the train of thought, the perspective that I should have. It was sort of ingrained in me and instilled in me for as long as I can remember. And I suspect that's probably different than a lot of people out there who maybe did not grow up in a church, family or an environment.
Yeah, but even for people who did, you're seeing, especially now that social media is available, a lot of people who were raised in the church and maybe raised by pastors going in the complete opposite direction. Abraham Piper is an example of that. John Piper's kid, who's open. I forget exactly what he calls himself, humanist or something like that. But he's certainly
secular humanist.
He certainly encourages people to walk away from Christianity and has a lot of negative things to say about Christianity. And he was raised right there. So, do you have any insight as to why that might be different for you?
In that case specifically, I don't. To me, it has always made sense. Christianity and a belief in God and the concept of Christ dying for our sins on the cross and paying a debt that we would never be capable of paying. It just always made sense to me, because otherwise, what purpose is there? What sense does anything in life make? Where's the ultimate reward, or the ultimate payment for things that you've done wrong? I think sort of morality and humanity kind of falls apart if you don't believe in that. At least for me, that's the way. And so it always kind of made sense to me. and again, when I did have questions and I asked questions, whether it was in reading scripture or hearing something on the radio or hearing something on TV or reading a particular article or someone who was around me and we engaged in a conversation, all of a sudden things sort of started clicking. It just always fallen into place for me. So I feel for those who struggle with their faith, because I've seen a lot of that around me as well. But that has never really been my personal experience.
Another thing, because you've talked before about us living in a fallen world, and you talked about Jesus paying a price that we could never pay. One of the things you'll hear from critics is that, well, the reason why we end up in a position where we're in a fallen world is God made us like that. We can't keep God's laws because we're limited by the capabilities. If God created us and wanted us to keep these certain laws, why did he create us to be wholly incapable of keeping those laws? Because to keep the laws is essentially impossible. And that's why we need Jesus. Nobody walking this earth is sinless. There was one perfect person. He lived 2,000 years ago. So that's something that I think a lot of people struggle with, at least the issues that I've heard from critics. Any response to that?
Yeah, if God would have created, and again, I mean, I don't speak for God.
Yeah, we're two guys hanging out.
Yeah, it's a little dangerous to put myself anywhere near that position. But the way that I understand it, the way that I rationalize it, is the alternative would have been God creating a universe and his creation people in his image and likeness who were robots, who were created to follow every rule without any variation or any differentiation, and everything's perfectly in line, and they follow all the rules, and nothing bad ever happens. And well, what fun is that? I mean, that's if your wife was a Stepford wife and was programmed to love you unconditionally, which she probably does anyway, but to be absolutely perfect, and everything in every relationship that you have is absolutely perfect. I mean, what fun is that? Life becomes predictable, becomes monotonous, and you start asking the question, well, what's the purpose of this? I think that's why, in my mind, God gave us free will, laid out a set of commandments and laws and teachings about how we can be better people, closer in our attitudes to him, but never able to really reach that level on this earth, because it gives us the free will to choose to understand or not to understand, and to either fall in line and do what then becomes sort of natural. I believe that when someone becomes a Christian, it changes their life. That your whole attitude towards the people you interact with, and the people you work with, the people you live with, your family, your job, situations in life, all of that changes, and people can see that there's been a change in you, because now you're trying to be more Christ-like. Whatever that means in your particular case, or in my particular case. So that's how I sort of rationalize that. Is otherwise we'd all be automatons, marching to a certain formula and a certain beat without variation. And well, what's the purpose in that?
So we're looking back at the American miracle, where they were disputing everything leading up to the Constitution. It seemed like they were bound by certain values at that point in time, where it made sense to be a country. When you look at the state of us today, and just as a couple of examples, you see responses to the assassination attempt on Trump, or to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. You see people responding with glee, glorifying, celebrating, condoning. Does it ever occur to you that maybe we're not in that same spot anymore? That we're not among people who should be sharing a country? Does that ever cross your mind?
It does. It's a pretty deep subject. You know, back then the colonists were they were under British rule. They were subjects of a country and government which they had absolutely no say really whatsoever, and taxes were imposed on them and laws were imposed on them without any ability to debate or change that or really impact that in any way. It was a different scenario. The channels of communication, like we identified before, weren't the kind that they were today. I think that in most cases, Americans today take for granted what it is that we have. Sort of the same concern that we talked about with Richard Dreyfuss. And we have a lot of freedom. We have the ability to communicate whether it's good ideas or bad ideas or something that's really, you know, abhorrent or very fringe philosophies in a far more effective way than they did 250 years ago. And this is something that I think concerns a lot of people. I think it concerns people possibly on the left as well as on the right. It's certainly something that concerned, you know, Charlie Kirk. And I think that the most important thing to learn out of that is that we have to keep a peaceful, honest discourse going, and people need to discuss these topics, hear all sides, and not become, for lack of a better word, sort of brainwashed into thinking some certain, you know, direction without any possibility for being convinced otherwise. And it becomes a real problem when people who voice their opinion, you know, are killed because of their opinion. But I mean, that's the coward's way out. You know, I mean, the way to tackle these issues is to have an open and honest discourse with people who speak their minds and their hearts, and people are either convinced or they're not, or it helps them better understand their own perspectives. And bystanders and listeners listen to it and digest it and compare it to their life experience and you know, their relationships and their circumstances. And that's the way that people have come about making changes throughout history. You know, not necessarily by killing each other, and that certainly should not be the solution.
Do you think we have to become okay with not agreeing on everything?
Yeah.
There are certain situations
we do that
where
all
we're
the
not gonna
time.
agree.
We do that in our families. You know, not always do we agree with our kids or our parents or our spouses, but compromise and you know, talking things out and ultimately, you know, accomplishing the greatest good for the greater number. And that's the way we should act. But you know, all you have to do is pick up the newspaper and read about people who don't operate their lives that way.
Yeah.
And that's a problem, but we all need to strive to work towards, you know, accomplishing that with our fellow men.
It's tough because there are certain issues that you don't want to compromise at all, or wouldn't be willing to compromise, or wouldn't be satisfied with a compromise. I know the Second Amendment community in general is just sick and tired of always giving more and more and more and more up over the last several decades. It's not like it's easier to access firearms today than it was in the 1960s. It's only become more and more and more restrictive. And you know, the Second Amendment community, the gun owners are always being told, why won't you compromise? After, you know, one after the other, after the other, after the other. There's no... The only positive moves we've seen are either at the state level with things like constitutional carry, or from judicial intervention, Supreme Court decision like Ruin. So does it make sense that, this is an interesting thing for the film too, because I think they would have had they obviously had an acute understanding of the importance of being able to keep and bear arms and not allowing the government to have a monopoly on firearms, and that seems to be lost on people today. And did you think about that at all when you were making the film?
Well, we did. I mean, obviously, those were also different times, but I've always been a Second Amendment supporter, and sort of certainly understand that perspective. I think that again, it gets back to people being able to speak their minds, to make their arguments, but to accept that not always are they going to be able to convince someone, and that's okay. Even in the question that you raised before about being a believer and believing in God and believing in Jesus, and ultimately it's not my responsibility. My responsibility as a Christian, if I believe the Great Commission, is to go out and preach the gospel, but nowhere does it says that I have to convert anyone. All we have to do is preach the gospel, live our lives as good Christians, and let that speak for itself. And ultimately, the listener will have to answer for their decision, whether or not they choose to heed that information or not. It's not my responsibility. So I think in all of these questions, it boils down to being able, again, like I said, to have a good, open, honest discourse. But ultimately, everyone has to answer for themselves. And, if I was wrong, back to the Christianity question, if I was wrong, then, oh well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. At least hopefully I was a better person in life and was easier to get along with in life. But if the person who doesn't believe is wrong, the potential circumstances are tragic, because it could mean an eternity of regret. I can't say that for myself, at least. So, doesn't really hit the Second Amendment question, but
no, it's a good point. It sort of wraps in there. Why do you think people get so heated to the degree that we do this day and age when having these discussions? Because you're talking about being okay with disagreeing. It doesn't seem like that's where we are. Issues, whether it be the Second Amendment or maybe it's the abortion issue. Why do you think people get so heated when we have these discussions?
I think it largely boils down to something that I've believed for all of my career, which is people have a basic lack of ability to step into someone else's shoes. One of the reasons why I enjoyed the time in my career when I was a negotiator and a mediator was because I enjoyed stepping into the other person's shoes, seeing the conflict through their lens, and trying to bring parties together to a table to agree on terms that they had in common, and bringing them to understand each other's concerns and an empathy for each other's concerns. I think that's one of the greatest issues today, is people are just so focused on their own perspective, and they have no appreciation or ability to see it from the opponent's perspective. So as in this unfortunate case with Charlie Kirk, the solution is you kill the opponent. Well, that's the cowardly way out. There's no art in that. The art is to do what he was doing, which is to debate and discuss with people, and have a discussion and present your perspective and see it from their perspective and have them see it from your perspective. And I would venture to say that 9 out of 10 times people come to a better understanding, and they might go away and say, well, we don't agree on this, but I really understand where he or she is coming from, and I have an appreciation for that. And I respect their ability to profess that opinion, provided it's not destructive. But so that's where I think the problem lies, is just in a basic human inability to see multiple sides of a same issue from other people's perspectives.
And that could be pretty difficult, though, right? When you're talking, let's just say, for example, the abortion issue, right? You often hear them cite the 3 exceptions that a lot of politicians believe in. I think Ronald Reagan was the first one to bring this up, or at least he's the popular one in my head, with its, I don't know if we can say the word on the air, but rape, incest, life of the mother. Mm-hmm. And whether or not you believe that it's inexcusable in any scenario whatsoever, from what you're saying, maybe you can look at somebody who's in one of those positions where their child has been raped and now they're pregnant and they're faced with making that decision. Maybe putting yourself in that person's shoes might make things a little bit different than thinking about all the times where somebody's doing it for no reason whatsoever. And not to say that it's anything but incredibly rare that those other exception situations happen, but is that an example maybe of somebody who's on our side? Because I'm trying to think of how do we do as you are commending at this point, like as somebody who's on our side, how do we look there and try to put ourselves in their shoes?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult. I mean, there are no simple solutions or discussions surrounding the topics that you mentioned and the scenarios that you mentioned. I mean, I am definitely pro-life, have been for as long as I can remember. Not to justify any of the horrific scenarios that have led to this, but I know at least 2 people who are the product of rape that are amazing individuals and accomplishing amazing things. Now, by their own admission, they would say, this is the way that I got here is horrific, but I am who I am, and and I can attest to the fact that they're doing amazing and incredible things for humanity as a whole. So again, this is such a difficult topic.
So maybe it's easier said than done to put ourselves in people's shoes.
It is.
Because I was thinking also, like, if you're saying that kids shouldn't have gender-altering surgeries at a young age and we shouldn't stand for that, and you get a parent who is advocating that their kid needs quote-unquote health care, gender-reaffirming care, I think is what they call it, and try to put yourself in somebody like that's shoes. I think that's another tough one.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not one to make fun of people who identify as transgender or anything, because I think that these are people who hurt a great deal as it is, and making fun of them, even if you disagree that they are what they say they are, that's not helping anybody, and it's not making the situation any better, and you shouldn't kick people when they're down.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But to try to put yourself in the shoes of the parent in that situation is making that decision on behalf of their child and saying that our laws should allow this sort of thing. And I don't know, isn't that a very difficult thing to do, to put yourself in their shoes and try to understand that? Yeah, no,
it is, and I would agree with you. I would, again, having come from a church background and being somewhat experienced in the dynamics of a church community, people have had issues and problems and concerns and disasters that occur to them, and what they're looking for more often than not is understanding and compassion and empathy, and sometimes just someone to discuss things with and to, again, help see a situation from different perspectives. And I don't profess to have any sort of an answer to these questions, but again, my Christian background would drive me to be compassionate and to do a lot of listening, and to try to help in any way that I can by even introducing other people that I may know that may be able to have a positive influence in whichever direction the person might need, as opposed to walking away. Another alternative is you just turn your back and walk away and say, "This is, I can't deal with this. This is your problem. You deal with it." I think we have a responsibility to try to help people think things through, especially when they come to us looking for that. I think we're put in those scenarios for specific reasons, again, by that invisible hand, if you will. And it's our responsibility to be compassionate and empathetic.
Do you think that we sometimes focus too much on politics and left versus right instead of bringing more people to Jesus?
You know, politics and religion are difficult to separate. You know, Jesus was a politician. I mean, it's, you know, every scenario practically in the Bible is a scenario in which politics is playing some role. So there's no way really of separating those two. I like the European definition of politics is what a person's perspective is on something. What are his politics? Here, it's become more of a dirty word, like they're playing politics, or, you know, the political struggle. I don't care for those labels. You know, they're there and we have to deal with them. But I think that, you know, again, we as Christians believe certain things, and whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or a libertarian or something else, you know, but we try to use the Bible as our guide for these things without putting labels on them, and you know, I don't like a lot of that political sort of struggle. I think it's largely unnecessary and maybe more of an example of ambition on the part of, you know, professional politicians to accomplish greater fame or power, or, you know, to reach higher office.
Do you think that, I know that where you land on certain issues that they're connected, but do you think that the better route is to lead people to Jesus and, you know, their politics will follow, rather than the other way around? Or do you think that by getting people involved in politics, if they choose to support a particular platform, it will necessarily lead to them following Jesus? I feel like one is a more natural flow than the other. Although I have seen a lot of people in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination saying they're coming to church for the first time, which is awesome.
Yeah, there was a lot of that. Just watching the news over the last couple of days, this past Sunday, the Sunday after Charlie Kirk's assassination, churches were like standing room only, and, you know, there was a lot of that. Yeah.
But I just look at places like when I was in LA, and you say, oh man, you know, they keep voting for Democrats over here. That's what's causing all of their problems. And we need to, you know, show people that they're voting for the same thing over and over again. And they're getting these bad results. And part of me said, you know, even if we are able to change things politically, that's not going to eliminate, you know, the root of the problem, because leading the people to Jesus would likely be the way. I think we've got a godlessness problem in this country, and, you know, everything from social media, instant gratification, and trying to seek each and every other possible avenue than Jesus all leads to the same place.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think this is another one of the points that Charlie Kirk always tried to make, is that he was asked on several occasions, and his widow Erica attested to this on Friday night, where, you know, he said, I want to be remembered as a person of faith. I want to be remembered as a person who was a very devout follower of Jesus. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that there's a lack of that. You know, I go back to what I said before. In my experience, those who have professed a true moment of salvation or a true devotion to Christianity, who become Christians, true devotion, that it changes their lives. And you can tell that from a mile away. And it changes the way you see the world, the way you approach interpersonal relationships, the way you solve problems and obstacles that come up in your life. If my personal philosophy is that if we saw more of that, not only in America, but in the world today, the world would be a very different place. It wouldn't be that perfect automaton place where everybody's suddenly falling into line and doing everything that they're supposed to and not breaking any laws. And we can close up the courts, we can close up prisons. None of that has ever happened. Certainly not that. But I think in America, at least from, again, that time that we illustrate in The American Miracle, there was a very high level of piety and theistic belief and lifestyle and worldview that I think unified the country in heading towards this direction of independence, getting out from under oppressive rule, establishing autonomy, and then going forward with that sort of as our guide and as the foundation upon which we move forward. We've fallen far from that, and I think that if we did return to that, and I think that's what Charlie was going for, and we'll see with all these new chapters now of Turning Point that are cropping up. We'll see if there's more of a movement in that direction. But I absolutely agree with you. I think that if there were more Christians, if people fell more in line with following Jesus and following his teachings and becoming true Christians, really true Christians, I think it would change the face of this country far for the better.
Do you think that, at least is it your hope, that people will watch this film and they'll feel more optimistic about where we could be as a country because of where we were and everything that we had to go through, and because of that providence, that no matter how bad it looks right now, that God's going to pull us out?
Mm-hmm. I certainly hope so. That's certainly our intent. And again, we get asked the question all the time as the producers, so you guys made a Christian movie about the American Revolution. And no, we didn't make a Christian movie about the American Revolution. We made a historically accurate movie about the Revolution. The fact that Christianity played a role in this, and maybe not so much Christianity as even just a theistic point of view and a theistic perspective and worldview. That's what really played a role during that period. So that's what this movie illustrates. And if you watch the movie and at the end of the movie you realize that, well, we don't sort of look the way we did back then, socially, culturally, as far as our communities are concerned, well, there's a reason for that. And maybe if we fall back in line with the type of worldview that those founders had, we may be able to return to that type of a worldview and perspective. But who knows? Who knows?
Tell us a little bit about the book that we've got sitting here on the table.
Forged by Providence, the Miraculous Rise of America. It's a book I wrote to be a companion book to the movie. In a movie, especially on a book like the one that Michael wrote, there are episodes, but there are parts between those episodes that you can't go into a lot of depth in. So what I took as sort of the thesis for this book was the chapters and episodes and stories that we tell in the movie, tying them together, filling in the blanks between those episodes, and then also including some behind-the-scenes photographs of how we filmed it, where we filmed it, the types of things we went through to accomplish what we did. So it's a complete telling of the story within the movie, but it's also telling the story of how we made the movie and filling in some of those gaps between the stories.
This is really cool. People can get it at
AmericanMiracleMovie.com.
You get all your needs over at the website.
That's right.
You can,
well, yeah, at least as far as the movie's concerned.
You can get the book. You can get you can stream the movie directly. I highly encourage people to check this out. Ralf, if you want to leave our audience with anything, you have anything additional you want to get across to them?
Again, the thesis of the movie is look back at what kind of an atmosphere there was in place that was fertile ground for the formation of this country. We don't know how lucky we are and how incredibly blessed and advantaged we are by living in the greatest Republican democracy the world has ever seen, with a constitution that was a groundbreaker, a Constitution like never had been written before, that has endured for 250 years. You know, we have such an incredible privilege, but are we taking advantage of that privilege and acting to preserve and advance the faith and values that our founding fathers embarked upon? I think that's a question we all have to ask ourselves.
Check it out. Make sure your family checks it out. Make sure your kids check it out. Ralf, thanks so much for joining us today.
Mike, thank you. A pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We miss you, Ellie. Daddy loves you. Thanks for tuning into the Mike G and the Garbage Gang podcast. If you want to be a proud member of the Garbage Gang, we need you to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, check out one of the recommended videos, and comment. Tell us what you think. We love having you as a member of the Garbage Gang. We'll see you next time.